Hello and welcome to this premium episode number 394. I'm Cornelius Fichtner. As always, premium means that this interview is reserved for you, our premium subscribers. Thank you very much for your financial support of the Project Management Podcast. One thing that every project manager notices over the course of her or his career is this. We begin with managing relatively simple projects. Here we learn about the theory of project management, its best practices, and how to apply them. And as we get better, we are assigned to bigger and more important projects. But in recent years, you may have begun to notice that even though your projects may not have become any bigger, their complexity has nevertheless steadily been increasing. In other words, if you took a project that you managed 5 years ago and repeated it today in exactly the same way, then the one thing that would definitely change is the complexity caused by an increase in interdependencies. And that's where Jordan Kyriakidis and I are starting this interview. We are exploring why complexity is increasing, whether it is actually real or just perceived, and what you can do about it. Enjoy the interview.
Project Management Podcasts feature interview.
Today with Jordan Kyriakidis, CEO and co-founder of QRA Corporation.
Hello, Jordan. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here.
In our first interview, we talked about natural language processing. The word complexity came up a couple of times, so we decided to follow it up with an interview on the increasing project complexity and how it's impacting us project managers. How do you define complexity yourself in the context of project management?
Well, that's like a 4-month-long course. It can go just on complexity.
Okay, we have 30 minutes.
I'll give the Coles Notes version. There's many measures of complexity. Some simple measures, which I think are not very good, is the budget, the length of the project, whether you've done it before. I've heard some companies say, if we've done a project before, then it's easy. If we've never done it before, then it's hard. But I think a kind of measure that I use, and I may be betraying my own background here, is a good measure of complexity is not how long your work breakdown structure is or anything simple like that. It is really the interdependencies of all the different components of the project. And if everything depends on many other things, then it is an example of a very complex project. I can give you maybe a more visual image that may be helpful. If you think of, let's say, for example, of all the tasks you need to do. Let's look at the work breakdown structure, and you draw that as like a graph. So you have a little circle that represents each task you want to complete. And then you draw a line between tasks that are related or interdependent. And so you have all these circles with the lines connected with them. Does that make sense so far?
It does.
And now if you look at that, and what you'll see for a very complex project, you'll see a lot of closed loops, a lot of circles, and a lot of ways you can start at one node and traverse around and come back to where you started from. Right? And the more of those you have, the more complex your project is. You can imagine a simple project that is very long. Say a project takes, you say this project is going to take like 8 years to complete, but you can do everything in a very clear, linear fashion that, the next task cannot begin until the previous one finishes. And there's one straight, it's like a one-dimensional path to completion. And it could be a very expensive project. It could be a very but that is a very simple project. The structure of it is very clear. A complicated network diagram, this is called, will not look like that. It'll have like loops and hookbacks, and it'll just look like they're very, very complicated.
So is this interdependency the main reason why project complexity is increasing, or is there something else?
Yes, there is an interdependency or an interaction between different components. And that is one of the primary reasons why projects fail or go far over budget, or the time just gets blown out of the water, is because of this. Because then what happens, you've heard this, you may have heard this refrain that it's possible to make no mistakes and still fail. Right? And what that means is that if you have a lot of interaction between all the various components of a project, what happens is that you can have something go wrong, and the error is not associated with any one particular task. The error is associated with how these tasks depend on each other, and it's the interaction where you have these problems arising.
How can our listeners recognize this increasing complexity? You gave us the visual of, draw out the WBS and start creating almost like a neural network to see what connects to what. Is that the only way? Are there any other ways?
I think that is a very good way to do it. That tells you right away whether you have something complex or not. Another thing you can recognize complexity is if you're doing, say, in the planning phase, and you start realizing that there's actually many different ways you can plan out this project in terms of, say, schedule. Let's talk about scheduling, for example. You realize that there's many ways you can schedule the project, and you can't really say one is better than the other. They're just different ways of doing it. That's one little clue you can have that you're dealing with something that's very complex. When you have to make choices, project managers are always making choices, and your choices are between things that it's not very clear which one is better overall than another choice, right? It depends. One choice may be better for certain things, not better in other things. And so that is almost a definition of a difficult choice. That will be another sign that you're dealing with an increasing complexity in your project. Another one is if you start doing, say, a sensitivity analysis, and you find that small changes can have a big impact, right? Especially a big impact on something that seems very unrelated to what you changed. Right? And it seems like there shouldn't be any connection there, but somehow there is. So these are all the things that are signs that you're dealing with a complex project. And my feeling is that the project managers listening now will have experienced all of these with increased frequency as we move into the future and the recent past.
We are living in a more and more interconnected world. Does this mean then that complexity is increasing on all projects? Or can you think of any areas where, no, it's not really increasing?
I would say it's not increasing on all projects, but generally speaking, the larger a project is these days, the more complex it is. Particularly, there are some some projects that are almost always becoming more and more complex. And that is if your project involves a lot of technology, if it involves a lot of software, and if it involves especially software and hardware integrated together into one unit. These are areas where I would say are ripe with complexity.
Is the increasing complexity actually a problem? Is this not simply a challenge that we project managers have to rise up to and meet?
Well, it is certainly the latter. It certainly is a challenge that project managers absolutely have to rise up and meet. There's no question of that. Whether it's a problem or not, I guess that may be a bit a semantic question. I think that it's a problem in the sense that it makes the job of managing the project more difficult. However, it is not a problem in the sense that complexity is bad and we should not have it. Right? And so if you look at, for example, maybe I can argue by example. And if you look at cars now are far more complex than they were, say, a generation ago. There's far more computer processing going on in there. But generally speaking, this is a good thing. Cars are actually much safer now. Cars are more reliable now. Cars, in almost any measure, are much better. And some of them are even getting less expensive too, even though they're becoming more complex. And so in that sense, complexity is a very good thing. But the poor project manager who has to manage the new technology in these cars, for them, there's new challenges involved with it.
I read an article of yours about this complexity, and one topic you talked about was the status quo. So two-part question here. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you mean by the status quo of handling project complexity, and also give us an example from a project that you experienced where the rise in project complexity meant that the status quo was no longer an option.
Well, so you can see the status quo varies from industry to industry, and I would say the status quo, for example, if we pick aerospace, the status quo for handling project complexity is you generally have a review. You start off with a systems requirements review, then you go on to preliminary design reviews, and then you go into actual implementation. Various industries have variations of the theme, right? You have these milestones that you have to meet, and they are requirements and designs before you go to the actual implementation. And the status quo, typically, if we take, say, let's dive in the middle of the process and you're doing a design review. If it's for a big project, this will involve people getting together in a big room, and they'll spend 3 or 4 days all getting in the room, and you'll have project managers, you'll have budget people, you'll have engineers in there, and they'll present the requirements, and they'll present the designs, and they'll discuss how these designs actually meet the requirements. And they'll go back and forth and discuss various scenarios, and they'll move on that way. And at the end of the meeting, they'll have a list of things that, are things that need to be addressed, some action items that before the project can move on, all these open loops have to be resolved, and then they can move on. That's when I say status quo, that's what I have in the back of my mind. I'm not sure if that's been your experience as well, for typically how this is done.
Yeah, pretty much. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So the reason why I think the status quo is no longer an option, so when will that work well? That works well if you have very highly qualified people in the room who are doing it for a while, are experienced, they know what they're doing, and they're working on a project that they've have seen before. They know how it works out. They've made mistakes in the past. So they know not to make those mistakes again. And if you have that situation, then I would say the status quo actually works pretty well. However, when you have this complexity at a level not seen before, when every phase depends on every other phase, and every task within a phase depends on many other tasks within that phase, and you're dealing with now new technology that hasn't been introduced before, and you're dealing with software infused throughout the whole system that you haven't had before. Now, people are less certain of where the risk lies and where the danger lies, especially if the danger really lies in not just one error happened, but a series of anomalies can happen in a certain order, and then that'll cause problems. They're very difficult to actually root out for humans. And so in these cases, you really cannot capture all the errors that are inherent in the document. And what you find is that you have these design reviews, and what will happen is there's going to be dangers lurking, dragons lurking in your project that you don't even know about. And so you don't have any mitigation plans for them until you start building something and you're deep into the implementation and you start seeing that things are not working the way they ought to be working. And you wonder why. And it's why, because you didn't uncover it way back in the design stage. I think that was rather a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it gets the picture across quite well. So how do you propose then that project managers handle or even thrive amidst this increase of complexity?
So, and I'm glad you phrased it that way, because there is, I think, an opportunity for project managers to really come out, I was going to say looking like heroes. That may be a bit of a stretch, but there is a chance that they can really shine here, because really I think it's really the project managers that can really have the data to be able to see the big picture. And one thing that project managers can do is to build models. And actually, the PMI website has some documentation and lots of good ideas on how to handle complexity. And if you build models, then there are tools out there that you can models, and you can analyze models, and you can look at how each individual piece of your project is affected by the others. So things like, for example, cost or duration. You can adjust the cost or duration of something, and you can really see how it affects all the other elements of the project. So there's a variety of models you can apply to see. I think really the best one is just to build models and to ask questions, very, very critical questions, and see if you can answer those questions.
I'd like to go back to something that you mentioned during the opening, sort of as an aside. Isn't complexity quite relative? A project that seems incredibly complex to me will look easy to another project manager who's already done this type of project 3 or 4 times before and has the experience of handling it.
Yes. The short answer to your question is yes. Come on.
All right, next question. No, just kidding.
So there is a measure of relative complexity, and it does very much depend on who's actually doing the management. I would say not just the project manager, it is also the organization itself, right? The people involved in the actual project. So the team, how good your team is, the leadership in the team, how well, if it's a big project, how well your supply chain is managed, how well people collaborate with each other. Of course, there is still the human element is always there. But what we're seeing now is that complexity is growing, that, so you're in an organization, say your organization handles projects of a certain complexity. As time goes on, your team is almost certainly dealing with more and more complex project for your organization. And that's the same that's I think true whether you have a little 25-person shop that does, moderately simple medical devices, or whether you have a big behemoth aerospace company that deals with 25-year projects. Those project managers can handle that level of complexity, but their next project will be more complex than they've seen of the previous projects.
In our first interview, we talked about natural language processing, and especially how it applies to requirements analysis and how tools can help us to go through the actual document and point out where we could, do with some improving there of the requirements descriptions. How does your tool, QV Scribe, help us with complexity?
How it helps you, QV Scribe looks at is one of our 2 tools, as you mentioned. It deals with analyzing technical requirements. What it does is it helps the stakeholder to analyze the requirements in order to uncover ambiguities, vagueness, and essentially risk. So because you have a very complicated project, or complex project, let's call it, lots of interdependencies, it is absolutely critical that very, very much at the start of the project, you have a document that clearly specifies what you're going to do and what outcome you want, and how do you know if you've achieved that outcome. So complexity is not something that you can finesse away and organize away. Projects are becoming complex because they are inherently complex. Systems are inherently complex. So you have to deal with the complexity And a good place to start is with your requirements and making sure they're absolutely crystal clear that if anyone reads this particular requirement, they know exactly what is meant and there is no two ways to interpret this particular requirement. The test engineer knows what test to make. The budget person knows how to actually cost it out. The schedule person knows how long it's going to take. It's all, I'm being a bit idealistic here, but that is what you should aim for. And QVScribe helps that. It highlights problem areas that are best practices.
Allow me to take a step a little bit outside of what we've talked about and still stay within complexity here. Recently, the new PMBOK guide has been published, and my company, we are a training company. We teach people how to prepare for the PMI exams. And of course, that means we have to update our training products from the previous version to this new version. This, for us, is a complex do or die project for the company. I have to tell you, I feel stressed out by this. So how should project managers deal with the stress that accompanies increasing complexity?
I wish I had a tool for that. I would say, sleep well. Make sure you get enough sleep. I would say, let me maybe be a little bit glib and say that stress, like complexity, is also relative, right? And so experience matters. And I would say that it's important to understand that complexity is just a fact of life, and it's something that has to be dealt with. And there are tools available to help with this complexity. And so I would say that one way a project managers can deal with the stress is maybe taking a kind of a student approach and think of it as something that needs to be learned and something that needs to be studied, and it's a process and a journey that we all of us have to take. It's not something that is going to go away, but it's not something that is also completely insurmountable. I feel very bullish for the future, and I think actually complexity can be a good thing. It just means that we have to, think of it as a kind of change management, that it's just a different way of looking things. Looking at the interaction between things is almost as important as the things themselves. And it just requires a change of viewpoint. And maybe from a psychological point of view is to understand that everybody is dealing with increased complexity, from rocket scientists to the modern family household. It's something that we all have to deal with, and we're all in it together.
And this is exactly where I wanted to go right now. You said complexity is increasing everywhere. Just to be 100% safe, are there any industries or project types that you can think of where complexity is in fact going down, where it's decreasing?
I would say that if you look at a particular project or a particular system, you can have a variety of views into this project. And what I mean by that is if you take, say, we talked earlier about an example of a car, so maybe we can use a car as a metaphor now. So on the one view of a car, you would say a car is far more complex than it was, decades ago. That is certainly true. I don't think anyone would say that cars today are simpler machines than they were previously. So in that sense, complexity is increasing. But from another viewpoint, and this is the viewpoint of the actual driver, it is actually simpler. Complexity has actually decreased when you drive, because now there is like a navigation system in the car. I don't have to worry about maps or figure out how I'm going to go. It's already there. If I'm backing up, I don't have to really worry about, there's a rear-facing camera. I can see the camera right back and get really close to the car without bothering to hit it. If I am driving on ice, I have anti-lock brakes. It'll help me be safer for my family and my children. These things actually decrease complexity. And so I think that most projects that increase complexity, oftentimes you have an increased complexity in the details and the core of the project. In this case would be the transmission or the engine of the car. It really is to make the outside layer much simpler, right? And so there is a simplicity that comes about with having a complex project as well. So that's kind of how I view it. I'm not sure if you think I'm kind of skirting the question or not, but that it really is how I view it.
No, it's definitely one way to look at it. And while you were talking about this, something else popped into my head. You mentioned cars are getting, or were getting, a lot more complex over the years, but at the same time, the tools that car manufacturers use in order to manage these projects, they have evolved along. We now have the tools to manage the complexities. We have the processes to manage the complexities. And of course, we have the systems to manage all of this together so that we can keep the complexity at bay as best as we can and get it to a successful completion at the other end.
I think that's an excellent point. There are an incredible amount of tools available now, far more than there ever been before, on how to manage the complexity and how to look at a project from different points of view in order to see things that may be askew that are due to complexity.
To close our interview, would you please give our listeners your top 3 tips on how to recognize and deal with this increasing complexity for their projects that they can start applying tomorrow?
I'll say number 1 is pay attention to the interactions between the components of your project. Oftentimes, it is the interactions between the various components that are at least as important as the actual components themselves. So pay attention to that. The second tip, we said we opened up by tips on how to recognize complexity in your project. Dealing with is, learn the tools that are available there. So try to adopt new tools and learn about new tools that can address your need. So I would say those would be the 3 top tips I would say. Pay attention to the interactions. Do like a network diagram of your project to understand if you're dealing with a complex problem. And to deal with it, use tools that are available for you to specifically deal with complexity.
You make it sound very easy. Thank you so much, Jordan, for your time today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, and good luck to you and all the listeners.
And that was our discussion with Jordan Kyriakidis. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com, and when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. There are 2 phases of any complex project: too early to tell and too late to stop. Until next time.